The war had ended in the Pacific that September of 1945. But for those women confined behind the steel and wire, the conflict felt far from finished. They sat in small clusters throughout the camp, these Japanese nurses, auxiliaries and followers who had been swept up in the machinery of war and now found themselves prisoners of the Americans. Their bodies bore the visible marks of weeks without adequate food, their faces carved into expressions of perpetual weariness. Every instruction they had received, every warning whispered by their commanders, had prepared them for brutality in captivity. Surrender meant the erasure of honor. Capture meant humiliation beyond measure. They had braced themselves for cruelty, for punishment, for treatment befitting those who had violated the sacred duty to die rather than be taken alive. What they encountered instead left them utterly unprepared. The sound reached them first, drifting across the dusty yard between the barracks and the perimeter fence. It was laughter, bright and unburdened, the kind that belongs only to children who have never known the weight of shame or the sting of dishonor. The sound moved through the camp like an unexpected breeze, finding its way into corners where silence had settled like sediment. At first, the women maintained their rigid postures on the worn benches near the mess hall, refusing to acknowledge the noise. They kept their eyes lowered, each woman locked in her own private struggle with fear and uncertainty. But the laughter grew impossible to ignore as it swelled and multiplied, punctuated by the sharp cries of delight and the rhythmic pounding of small feet against dry earth. American children had appeared near the outer fence, engaged in games that seemed to exist outside the realm of war entirely. They chased each other in elaborate patterns, their movements free and unrestrained, their voices carrying no trace of the discipline that had been hammered into every Japanese child from the moment they could understand words. The women's eyes lifted despite their determination to remain indifferent. They watched these foreign children with a mixture of emotions too complex to name. Some pressed their hands across their mouths, hiding reactions they could not quite suppress. A few began to produce sounds that might have been laughter, though it emerged strained and uncomfortable, more an expression of profound disbelief than genuine amusement. One woman broke the silence with a harsh whisper, declaring that these American children were obviously foolish, lacking any semblance of proper discipline. Her companions murmured agreement, finding comfort in this interpretation. In their homeland, children had been transformed into soldiers before they finished growing, drilled with bamboo spears until their small hands blistered, taught to bow before the emperor's image with the same reverence reserved for the divine, instructed in the art of choosing death over the disgrace of surrender. Japanese children had been prepared to sacrifice themselves as naturally as they prepared for each new day. These American children, by contrast, seemed to exist in a different reality altogether, one where laughter carried no consequences and play required no permission. The contrast cut through the women like something sharp. They found themselves laughing back at the children, their sounds edged with something bitter and defensive. Their giggles were not expressions of joy, but attempts to master the confusion rising inside them. Another woman leaned close to whisper her observation that the children ran about like untamed animals, showing not the slightest awareness of the prisoners watching from behind the wire, displaying none of the fear or respect that should characterize any child's response to captured soldiers. A small boy interrupted their whispering by breaking away from his game and approaching the fence directly. He pressed his entire face against the wire mesh, his nose flattening comically against the steel, his eyes wide with unguarded curiosity as he grinned at the women inside. The prisoners turned away as one, hiding their reactions behind raised hands, muttering about rudeness and the complete absence of proper respect. Yet the boy remained at the fence, undeterred by their rejection. He lifted one small hand in what appeared to be a clumsy attempt at a salute, his fingers not quite forming the proper shape. This gesture provoked another wave of uncomfortable laughter among the women. Some shook their heads in apparent disapproval. Others gripped their sleeves more tightly, uncertain whether the boy was mocking them or simply engaging in innocent play. The ambiguity troubled them deeply. In their experience, children were supposed to regard soldiers with fear, or at the very least with solemn respect. War had stolen childhood from every Japanese child they knew, replacing games with grim preparation for death. Yet here stood a child who seemed to find their uniforms amusing rather than frightening, who approached the fence out of curiosity rather than terror. The women told themselves repeatedly that this behavior was ridiculous, that these children had been ruined by excessive indulgence and the absence of proper military values. They clung to these judgments because the alternative was too destabilizing to contemplate. Yet beneath their criticism something else stirred, a feeling uncomfortably close to envy. As they watched the children run and shout without restraint, memories surfaced unbidden. They remembered younger brothers back home who had been handed weapons instead of toys long before they were ready. They remembered cousins pulled into military service before their bodies finished growing. They remembered their own childhoods, truncated and militarized, transformed into training grounds for a war that consumed everything. One woman among them, a nurse who had not yet reached her 20th birthday, covered her mouth with both hands as her shoulders began to shake. She was laughing, or perhaps something that resembled laughter, but the sound contained no mockery. She was responding to the profound impossibility of everything she was witnessing, the fundamental wrongness of a world where enemy children played freely, while Japanese children were being molded into instruments of national sacrifice. She did not understand yet that this laughter represented only the opening movement of a much larger transformation. She could not know that those same children, the ones she now watched with such confusion, would soon address her using a word she never expected to hear from anyone on this side of the war. The children returned the following afternoon, their games creating a soundtrack that echoed off the barrack walls and hung in the air like something tangible. The women gathered again, though they told themselves they were merely passing time, merely observing with detached curiosity. Their eyes, however, revealed a different story, tracking the children's movements with an intensity that betrayed genuine interest. The boys engaged in racing games, their paths forming complex patterns in the dust, while the girls stood in small circles, clapping and singing rhymes composed of syllables the prisoners could not pass. Their clothing showed signs of careful mending, patches visible but clean, their hair secured with ribbons that caught the light. They were ordinary children in every possible way. Yet to the women behind the fence, they seemed like creatures from another world entirely. Beings who operated according to rules that made no sense in the context of everything the prisoners understood about war and consequence. An older prisoner spoke with undisguised bitterness, pointing out that these children played their games while Japanese children starved in villages across the homeland. The others nodded, their thoughts immediately drawn to the desperate conditions they knew existed in Japan, where mothers resorted to boiling tree bark in a futile attempt to fill their children's stomachs. The guilt of this comparison sat heavy in their chests. And yet, despite their determination to resist, the sound of the children's joy worked its way past their defences. Against their will and better judgment, some of the women began to smile. Others whispered sarcastic observations, using mockery as a shield against the pain that threatened to overwhelm them if they allowed these foreign children's happiness to penetrate too deeply. Then the situation shifted in a way none of them anticipated. A little girl, perhaps 8 years old at most, separated herself from the group and walked directly toward the fence. She carried a red ball in her small hands, its paint chipped away in places, the leather surface marked with the scuffs of extensive use. When she reached the fence, she pressed the ball against the wire and pushed it forward gently, as though making an offering. The women recoiled instinctively, none daring to reach toward it. Frantic whispers spread through their group. Was this some kind of trick? Was the child mocking them? Was this a test designed to humiliate them further? The girl simply smiled, her teeth slightly crooked, her eyes radiating nothing but sincere friendliness. One of the American guards moved toward the scene, and the women tensed, expecting intervention. Instead, the guard merely shook his head with an indulgent smile and allowed the child to remain. For him, this was harmless play, a child being a child. For the prisoners, the guards' permissiveness registered as deeply shocking. Finally, one of the younger women, barely past her 18th year, extended her hand with obvious caution, her fingers trembling as they made contact with the rough leather through the fence opening. The little girl's face lit up with delight, and she pushed harder, sending the ball rolling beneath the wire until it came to rest at the woman's feet. The prisoners remained frozen, staring at the ball as though it were some sort of unexploded ordnance. The bright red sphere sat in the dust of their captivity like a piece of another world, a fragment of innocence that had somehow penetrated their imprisonment. Slowly, moving as though the ball might vanish if she acted too quickly, the young woman bent and lifted it, turning it over in her hands with extreme care. The prisoners erupted in nervous laughter, covering their mouths in a gesture that had become habitual. The child responded by clapping her hands and bouncing on her toes. Then she shouted something in English, pointing first at the ball and then at herself. Her meaning was clear even without shared language. She wanted them to throw it back. The women looked at each other, their laughter now mixed with genuine disbelief. Someone whispered that the children actually wanted to play with them, with prisoners, with enemies. The idea seemed impossible. But the girls' expectant expression and hopeful posture broke through their resistance. The young woman who held the ball tossed it weakly back through the fence, her arm lacking the strength for anything more forceful. The girl caught it with a squeal of pure delight and ran back toward her companions. A game began, one that paid no attention to barbed wire or uniforms or the historical weight of the war that had just ended. The women laughed again, but this time the quality of their laughter had changed. The mockery had drained away. The bitterness had softened. What remained was the laughter of memory, of recognition, of being transported back to a time when they too had been girls, when play had not yet been stolen by war and duty and the demands of national sacrifice. As the children cheered and clapped, the prisoners felt something long dormant beginning to stir within them. They could not have named it yet, did not dare to speak it aloud, but it felt dangerously similar to hope. The game with the red ball became a fixture of their days, a ritual they anticipated, though they claimed to be indifferent. Each afternoon brought the children back with their ball, and the pattern of throwing and catching continued, bridging the gap between wire and world. The women laughed more freely as the days passed, their hands no longer rising automatically to cover their expressions. The guards maintained their positions but chose not to intervene. At first, the prisoners continued to offer critical commentary in their whispered conversations. They giggled about the children's clumsy throwing technique, noted how soft their hands looked, observed that these were clearly hands that had never performed real labour in fields or factories. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the sarcasm began to lose its edge. The laughter transformed into something more genuine, less defensive, tinged with an emotion that resembled childlike wonder. One afternoon, the little girl pressed her face against the wire once more. She pointed at one of the women, a nurse whose eyes held an uncommon gentleness and whose dark hair was tied back beneath a scarf. Then, in a voice high and clear as a bell, she called out a single word: "Mother." The sound struck the women like a physical force. They exchanged glances, their laughter dying instantly. Surely they had misheard. Surely this child had not just called a prisoner by that most intimate of names. But the girl repeated it without hesitation. "Mother." She pointed again, beaming, her small hand gripping the wire as though it were nothing more than a garden fence. The women's faces flushed with colour. Some turned away completely, unable to meet the child's gaze. Others whispered urgently among themselves, their voices thick with confusion and something approaching distress. Why would she call them that? They were prisoners, enemies, women who had surrendered when they should have chosen death. Mothers belonged in homes, surrounded by family, honoured and secure. Mothers did not exist behind barbed wire. Yet the child persisted, her small voice cutting through their protests, pointing at each woman in turn and pressing the word into their consciousness like a brand. Mother, mother, mother. She sang it almost, laughing as though the name itself were a delightful game. One woman finally laughed in response, covering her entire face with both hands. Another shook her head slowly, whispering that these children were strange beyond comprehension. But inside, in places they had learned to keep carefully guarded, something fundamental shifted. For years they had been instructed that they were expendable, that surrender had stripped them of honor, that captivity had stolen whatever worth they might have once possessed. Yet here stood a child, an American child, who looked at them and saw not enemies, not prisoners, not objects of scorn, but mothers. The irony of it pierced through every defense they had constructed. Many of these women had left children of their own behind in Japan, children now facing starvation, children they might never see again, never hold again, never hear call them by that name again. And yet here, across a fence that separated nations and languages and everything they understood about the war, strangers called them by the very name they longed most to hear. The young nurse pressed her hand against her chest, her laughter breaking into something harder to control. As the children eventually ran off, still laughing, still shouting that word, the women were left sitting in stunned silence. Their giggles returned, yes, but softer now, weighted with something heavier than amusement. They had been called enemies by their captors, prisoners by the guards, dishonorable by their own people. But never, in all their darkest imaginings, had they expected to be called mothers by the children of those who had defeated them. The days that followed brought changes none of them could have predicted. The children, emboldened by the game's success and the women's gradual acceptance, began arriving with more than just a ball. They came bearing gifts, simple things that children might share without thinking. An apple extracted from a lunch basket, a handful of wildflowers plucked from the roadside, a stick of chewing gum carefully divided in half. The women regarded these offerings with expressions usually reserved for precious artifacts. For months, their existence had consisted of thin soup and stale bread, rations that barely sustained life. Now small hands slipped fruit through the wire, and they hesitated to accept, uncertain of the implications, worried about the cost of such kindness. One woman finally reached out, her fingers trembling visibly as she closed them around an apple. She held it as one might hold porcelain, then pressed it to her lips without taking a bite. Tears gathered in her eyes and spilled over. The others whispered in astonishment, stunned by her reaction, moved by the depth of emotion a simple piece of fruit could unlock. The children laughed, delighted by the response, unable to understand the magnitude of what they had given. To them it was nothing significant. An apple, a flower, a piece of candy. But to the prisoners, each item represented proof of something that contradicted everything they had been told about their enemies. These were acts of kindness, genuine and unforced, coming from the very people they had been trained to fear and hate. The nurse, who had first been addressed as mother, received a daisy from the little girl, its petals slightly crushed from being held in a small fist. She tucked it into her hair, and the women around her giggled, nudging her shoulders, whispering that she looked like a bride preparing for her wedding. She laughed too, but her laughter shook with emotion she could barely contain. The guards observed these exchanges, but made no move to stop them. Perhaps they understood the power of such simple gestures. Perhaps they recognized that gifts possessed a unique ability to penetrate walls that weapons and threats could never breach. One afternoon, a boy slipped a drawing under the fence, a crayon illustration on paper showing messy stick figures holding hands in a row. The women crowded around it, their faces softening as they studied the childish artwork. The boy had drawn them, not as prisoners in a camp, but as family members connected by love. Some of the women laughed until their laughter transformed into tears. Others wept silently, clutching the paper against their chests as though it were a letter from home. One whispered that she had not seen a child's drawing since her son had scribbled on their kitchen wall back in Japan, back before the war consumed everything familiar and safe. The irony deepened with each passing day. These American children, complete strangers separated by language and culture and the entire weight of a brutal war, were treating them not as enemies to be feared or despised, but as mothers, sisters, aunts. The word mother returned again and again, shouted in playful voices, echoed by more and more children as they gathered near the camp each afternoon. At first, the women resisted this naming, laughed it away as a defense mechanism, mocked the foolishness of children who could not understand the proper categories of war and enmity. But soon they could no longer hide from what the word stirred inside them. Each flower, each apple, each scrap of candy represented more than material sustenance. These gifts were recognition. They were acknowledgement. They were proof that they had not been entirely erased by defeat and capture. The women had expected scorn. They had braced themselves for humiliation. Instead, they were given respect, even affection. And remarkably, impossibly, it came not from soldiers who might understand the complexity of war, not from officers who had studied the rules of proper conduct toward prisoners. It came from children too young to comprehend the weight of history, too innocent to know that they were supposed to hate the women behind the wire. That evening, as the sun descended toward the horizon and the children disappeared back into their lives beyond the camp, the women sat together in silence. The gifts lay in their laps, fragile but undeniably real. One woman spoke barely above a whisper, saying that the children did not see prisoners when they looked through the fence. Another answered softly, completing the thought. They see mothers. And for the first time since their capture, the women began to wonder if perhaps they were seeing themselves differently as well. If perhaps the children's perspective was reshaping their own understanding of who they were and what they might still become. The children no longer maintained any distance from the camp's edge. By the time late September arrived, they had begun slipping closer to the wire, pressing their faces and small hands against the metal barrier. Their laughter flowed into the compound like water finding cracks in stone, filling spaces that had previously echoed only with silence and shame. The women discovered themselves gathering each afternoon now, waiting for the children's arrival. They told themselves and each other that they came merely to watch, merely to laugh at the foolishness of American child-rearing, merely to pass time in a place where time moved with agonizing slowness. But deep inside, in places they preferred not to examine, they knew something else was drawing them to that fence. One boy with sun-bleached hair that stuck out in every direction reached through the wire one afternoon. He stretched his fingers as far as they would go, wiggling them playfully in the direction of the prisoners. The women gasped as one, instinctively pulling back. To touch an enemy was unthinkable, a violation of everything they understood about proper conduct and the maintenance of boundaries. And yet, slowly, moving as though in a dream, one woman extended her hand. Her fingers brushed his for just a moment, a fleeting contact that lasted perhaps a second. The warmth of another human being's skin registered immediately. The boy laughed with pure delight, as if this were merely another game. The woman snatched her hand back quickly, covering her mouth, producing sounds that were half laughter and half something closer to fear. The others giggled nervously, whispering to each other that these children were too bold, too forward, lacking any sense of proper boundaries. But their eyes remained fixed on the fence, on those small hands that reached through without any trace of hesitation or fear. Soon more children pressed their palms flat against the wire. Some of the younger women began touching them hesitantly, palm to palm, divided by steel mesh but connected nonetheless. Their laughter was no longer mocking or defensive. It had become soft, surprised, almost maternal in its quality. For years they had been told they were dishonoured, worthless, tainted by the simple fact of their continued survival. But now little hands sought them out, unafraid, even eager. To the children they were not prisoners or enemies. They were people, sources of warmth and comfort and safety. The word came again, cutting through all other sound. "Mother!" A girl shouted it while pressing both her hands against the wire. The women laughed, shaking their heads, but tears stung their eyes and blurred their vision. To be called mother by a stranger's child was bewildering and wonderful and painful all at once. Yet it pierced deeper than any insult ever could. One prisoner, older than most of the others, whispered that she had left her own son behind in Nagasaki. She had not heard him call her mother in years, had no way of knowing if he still lived, if he still remembered her voice. Her hands trembled as she touched the fence, as though by reaching toward these foreign children she might somehow reach across oceans and touch her own child again. The guards glanced at the scene unfolding before them, but did nothing to stop it. Perhaps they understood the power in that moment. Perhaps they saw that something beyond simple captivity was happening here, something that transcended the usual relationship between prisoner and guard. By this point, the laughter of the children had stopped being merely a curiosity or a temporary distraction. It had become a lifeline, a rope thrown across the divide between despair and something that might eventually resemble hope. Each day, their visits chipped away at the walls of fear and bitterness that war had built around the women's hearts. That night, the prisoners lay awake in their bunks, staring at the ceiling of their barracks, their hands still tingling from the touches they had shared. Their minds replayed the sound of children's voices, calling them mother over and over again. For the first time since captivity began, they felt something dangerously close to comfort. And comfort, they realized with a start, was more unsettling than cruelty ever could be, because comfort raised a question none of them dared ask aloud. Had they become more than prisoners in the eyes of their enemies' children? Had they been transformed by these innocent voices into something precious again? The following week brought yet another unexpected development. The children no longer limited themselves to tossing balls or passing flowers through the fence. They began teaching games, using gestures and demonstrations when words failed to bridge the language gap. One boy drew a circle in the dirt with a stick, then motioned for the women to throw small stones, aiming for the center. At first, they shook their heads, embarrassed by the proposition. They were prisoners, grown women, some of them mothers who had left their own children behind. How could they possibly engage in children's games? But the boy kept grinning, kept gesturing, tossed his own stone and shouted in triumph when it landed near the circle's center. Finally, one young prisoner bent down, selected a pebble, and threw it with a tentative motion. The children erupted in wild applause, clapping and cheering as though she had accomplished something magnificent. The women laughed, louder this time, less restrained by shame or fear. Soon more of them joined in, tossing stones, giggling like schoolgirls, forgetting for brief moments the fences that surrounded them. For years they had been instructed that discipline represented strength, that laughter was foolishness, that joy was a weakness unfit for soldiers or anyone who served the empire. Yet here, across the wire, children were shattering that belief system with nothing more than games and enthusiasm. One girl began teaching a clapping rhyme, pressing her palms against the fence and chanting words in English that made no sense to the prisoners. They did not understand the lyrics, could not have translated a single phrase, but they mimicked the rhythm, laughing as they stumbled over the beats and timing. The laughter became contagious, rolling through the camp in waves. Even the guards found themselves smiling, their typically stern expressions softening as they watched former enemies and American children play together across a barrier that suddenly seemed less solid than it had before. The women began to understand something profound, though they struggled to articulate it even to themselves. The children were not mocking them. They were teaching them, but not in the way adults typically teach children, not words from books or lessons about history or mathematics. Instead, they were teaching the lost art of being human without fear, of finding joy even in circumstances that seemed designed to crush it. One prisoner whispered, almost to herself, that the children laughed at them, but not in cruelty. They laughed to bring them in, to include them, to pull them across that wire through sheer force of joy. She covered her mouth quickly, ashamed of having spoken such a thought aloud, but the truth of it lingered in the air around them. The word mother came again, shouted between claps and chants. The women's eyes glistened as they heard it repeated. Some turned away, afraid of what emotions it might unleash if they allowed themselves to fully acknowledge it. Others permitted themselves to smile, even as tears streaked down their faces and caught the afternoon light. For the first time since capture, they felt like more than bodies occupying space, more than former soldiers awaiting judgment, more than prisoners existing in limbo. To the children, they were mothers, sisters, family members worthy of love and attention, and that recognition unravelled them in ways the barbed wire never could, penetrated defences that had seemed impenetrable. That evening, the camp buzzed with whispered conversations. The women replayed the games in their minds, recalled the laughter, heard the word mother echoing in their memories. Some admitted quietly that they had not laughed like that since they themselves were children, before war transformed childhood into military training. Laughter had become dangerous in wartime Japan, seen as weakness, punished as disrespect toward the emperor and the national mission. Yet here, in an enemy prison camp, laughter had become survival, connection, even healing. And the women could no longer deny the obvious truth. The American children were teaching them how to live again, how to be human again, how to believe they might deserve more than punishment and shame. A week later, the women noticed the children carrying something different in their hands. Not flowers or toys or food, but scraps of paper. Crumpled notebook sheets, pages torn from school books, folded carefully in small hands as though they contained something precious. The prisoners crowded near the fence as the children held them up, showing drawings of stick figures holding hands in long chains, hearts scrawled in red crayon, and clumsy words written in English. The women tilted their heads, struggling to make sense of the symbols and letters. One of them, who had learned a few English phrases from her brother before the war, squinted at the shaky letters and began to translate. "We love you." Her breath caught in her throat. She whispered the words aloud in Japanese, and the other women gasped, their hands flying to their mouths in shock. Could it possibly be true? Were the enemy's children actually telling them, prisoners and outsiders, that they were loved? The guards observed the exchange but did not intervene. They allowed it to continue, perhaps even encouraged it through their silence. Slowly, with hands that trembled violently, the women reached through the fence to accept the letters. Some pressed them against their hearts immediately. Others kissed the crayon marks as though they were sacred relics blessed by priests. One note simply read, in crooked English letters, "You are not bad." Another said, "Be strong." And one, written in a child's careful hand with obvious effort, said, "I wish you were my mother." That last message broke the collective silence that had held. A woman sobbed openly, clutching the paper as though it were her own child's voice speaking across impossible distances. She had lost her son in the firebombing of Tokyo, and here, through this wire fence in an American camp, she felt him again, felt the presence of a child calling her mother. For others, the letters unlocked memories they had carefully buried. Bedtime stories whispered to children who might no longer remember their voices. Lullabies hummed in darkened rooms now reduced to ash. The scent of rice cooking in homes that existed only in memory. The word mother echoed again, but this time not as playful chanting or part of a game, but as something written down, permanent, undeniable. It was not mockery, it was not cruelty. It was an offering, a gift given freely without expectation of return. Some women could not hold the weight of it all. They collapsed onto the dirt, clutching the notes, whispering prayers of thanks or apologies to children they had been forced to abandon by the mechanics of war. That night, the women shared the papers among themselves, passing them carefully from hand to hand, tracing the drawings with their fingertips as though the ink were precious metal. For the first time in captivity, they slept with something tucked under their pillows, not out of fear of theft, but because they wanted to keep these messages close. One woman whispered into the darkness where others lay awake. "If the children can forgive us, maybe the world can too." And though none dared to say it aloud, they all understood in their hearts. The children had given them something that neither soldiers nor peace treaties could ever provide. A second chance to believe in love, to imagine a future beyond wire and shame. By the following week, the atmosphere throughout the entire camp had undergone a visible transformation. The guards, who had once maintained stern expressions and kept their rifles at the ready, began noticing that the women were smiling, sometimes faintly, sometimes shyly, but always after the afternoon visits from the children. The changes were subtle at first, a woman brushing her hair with more care than simple hygiene required, another humming quietly under her breath while performing routine tasks. One even stitched a small flower onto the corner of her prison-issue blouse using thread she had painstakingly unravelled from a blanket. The guards exchanged puzzled looks. They had grown accustomed to silence, fear, and mutual suspicion, but now something softer was taking root behind the wire. They decided to observe without interference, curious to see where this unexpected development might lead. When the children returned for their daily visits, they stayed longer than before. A few sat cross-legged in the dust directly against the fence, telling stories in English the women could not comprehend. Yet somehow tone and gesture carried meaning that transcended language. The women listened with intense attention, nodding along, smiling, laughing at the children's exaggerated hand motions and facial expressions. They did not need translation. The language of play and innocence proved universal after all. One afternoon, a guard overheard a little girl asking her mother on the other side of the camp fence a question that would stick with him. Why are they sad? The mother, apparently unsure how to explain prisoners of war to a young child, simply responded, "Because the world forgot to love them." That answer somehow reached the women's ears, carried perhaps by wind or by the guard who repeated it later. Forgotten. The word fit better than any other they could think of. Forgotten by their nation, which had sent them to war and then condemned them for surviving it. Forgotten by their commanders, who had promised honour in death but offered nothing for those who lived. Forgotten by the war itself, which had moved on and left them in this limbo. And yet these children seemed absolutely determined to remember them, to see them, to insist on their continued existence and worth. The guards, men hardened by combat and trained to maintain emotional distance, felt their own walls beginning to crack. A few began quietly slipping extra bread or pieces of candy into the parcels left near the barracks, as though following the children's example without acknowledging what they were doing. One woman, pale and gaunt from months of inadequate food, stared at a chocolate bar that had been handed through the fence. She shook her head, refusing the gift. The guard who had brought it simply shrugged and said, "Keep it. The kids told us to." She froze at those words, then laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. It was this laughter, more than anything else, that truly stunned the guards. Laughter inside a POW camp had seemed unthinkable. Yet now it echoed against the barbed wire regularly. The sound startled them initially, but gradually it began to soften something in them as well. The Americans had been trained to view these women as prisoners first, as potential threats to security, as living reminders of a brutal war that had cost countless lives. But watching them cradle drawings like treasures, press candy to their lips with reverence, and actually dare to laugh with genuine joy, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the mental category of enemy. The women themselves felt the shift occurring. They began looking at the guards differently as well, not as jailers keeping them confined, but as men who carried photographs of their own children in their pockets. Men who, like themselves, had been pulled into a war that neither side had fully chosen, that had consumed lives and futures with indiscriminate hunger. That night, one prisoner whispered into the quiet barracks, her voice barely audible, "Maybe we are not forgotten anymore." No one contradicted her. No one laughed at the foolishness of hope. They simply lay in the darkness, thinking about children who had chosen to remember them, who had given them back their names, their humanity, their right to be loved. The afternoon sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the fence line like fingers reaching into the camp. A group of American children arrived carrying paper bags, each one stuffed with mysterious contents that rustled with every movement. The women watched with intense curiosity, exchanging whispered speculations about what might be hidden inside. The bags crinkled as the children set them down carefully in the dust just outside the wire. One boy reached into his bag and pulled out a ball, worn and patched but obviously still functional. He bounced it once, twice, testing its integrity, and then rolled it gently under the fence toward where the women sat. The prisoners hesitated, their old fears surfacing immediately. Was this a test of some kind? A trap designed to humiliate them? But then one of the younger girls among them, barely 18 years old, reached out with obvious nervousness and picked the ball up from where it had stopped rolling. The children erupted in applause and cheers, clapping their hands together enthusiastically. The girl blushed deeply, colour flooding her thin face, and she hugged the ball as if it were made of gold. What happened next surprised everyone present. The boy who had rolled the ball made a throwing motion, gesturing for her to send it back. She did so, awkwardly, her arm weak from months of malnutrition and inactivity. The ball rolled short of its target. But the children did not laugh cruelly or mock her weakness. They laughed with pure joy, encouraging her to try again with enthusiasm and patience. Soon the fence itself became the boundary line of an improvised game. Back and forth the ball went, rolling under the wire, tossed over it, caught and missed, each mistake greeted not with criticism but with laughter that filled the air and seemed to make it lighter somehow. The women joined in the laughter, at first softly, tentatively, then louder and freer until the sound became unmistakable. This was laughter, real laughter, the kind they had once believed had been buried forever under the weight of war and shame. One of the older women, who had not permitted herself to smile since her capture months ago, laughed so hard that tears ran down her cheeks. She wiped them away and whispered to no one in particular that she had thought she would never feel this again, never experience this particular quality of joy that comes from play and connection. The guards leaned against their rifles, watching this bizarre scene unfold before them. War had transformed laughter into a rare luxury, something to be rationed like food or water. Yet here it was, spilling freely across the barbed wire, defying all the rules about how prisoners and their captors were supposed to interact. The children began pulling more objects from their bags, creating a small pile of treasures. Small dolls with yarn hair, wooden cars carved by hand, scraps of candy wrapped in colourful paper. They handed each item through the fence as though it were Christmas morning, as though giving gifts to prisoners was the most natural thing in the world. The women accepted each offering with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the simple generosity. It was too much for some to bear. A young mother among the prisoners, a woman who had once held her own child back in Japan before the war swallowed everything, held a doll and pressed it against her chest. She broke down sobbing, her entire body shaking with the force of grief long suppressed. The children did not fully understand the depth of her sorrow, could not comprehend the weight of loss she carried. But they understood tears. One little girl reached through the fence and patted the woman's hand gently, whispering a word she would not have understood even if she had been listening. Mama. That single word pierced the moment like lightning splitting the sky. The other women gasped collectively. Mama. A name they thought had been stolen from them forever. A role they believed they had forfeited through surrender and capture, suddenly restored by a child's innocent lips and pure heart. From that moment forward, the prisoners were no longer just captives occupying space in an American camp. In the eyes of the children, they had been transformed. They were women again. They were mothers again. They were human beings deserving of love and respect. And in that recognition came a flood of emotions, laughter and tears mixed together. Proof that even behind barbed wire, dignity could be reborn, humanity could be reclaimed, and hope could take root in the most unlikely soil. That evening, long after the children had been called home and the last echoes of their laughter had faded into silence, The women sat together in their barracks. They did not speak much. Words seemed inadequate for what they were feeling. Instead, they held the gifts they had been given, turning them over in their hands, memorizing every detail. A doll with button eyes, a wooden car with wheels that actually turned, a piece of candy wrapped in paper decorated with stars. These were not just objects, they were evidence, proof that they had been seen, acknowledged, valued. Proof that somewhere beyond the wire, children remembered them not as enemies, but as mothers. And in that remembering, they had found a reason to believe that perhaps, somehow, they might survive this with their souls intact after all.